Hello, today we're going to be talking about Lecture 5, Environmental Systems and Ecosystem Ecology. This chapter will help students describe the nature of environmental systems, define ecosystems, and evaluate how living and non-living entities interact in ecosystem-level ecology, outline the fundamentals of landscape ecology, GIS, and ecological modeling, assess ecosystem services and how they benefit our lives, compare and contrast how water, carbon, nitrogen, and the phosphorus cycle through the environment, and explain how human impact is affecting biogeochemical cycles. So today, again, we're going to begin with another central case study, this time on the vanishing oysters of the Chesapeake Bay. The demise of Deal Island in Maryland was caused by the collapse of the Chesapeake Bay oyster fishery, and the Chesapeake Bay was once a thriving system. Nutrients carried to the bay by streams in its roughly 64,000 square mile watershed, the land area that funnels water to the bay through rivers, and this nourished the underwater environment there. Hundreds of millions of oysters kept the bay's water clean by filtering nutrients and phytoplankton, which are microscopic photosynthetic algae, protists, and cyanobacteria that drift near the surface from the water column. The intensive harvest of bay oysters for export began in the 1830s, and by the 1880s, the bay boasts the world's largest oyster fishery. But by 2010, the bay's oyster population had been reduced to a mere 1% of their historical abundance. Oysters naturally filter nutrients from the water, but with so few oysters today, elevated nutrient levels have caused the phytoplankton in the bay to explode. When phytoplankton die, settle to the bay bottom, and are decomposed by bacteria, oxygen in the water is depleted, a condition called hypoxia, which creates dead zones in the bay. Recent events in the Chesapeake have at long last given reason for hope for the recovery of the Chesapeake Bay system through a couple of ecological restorations going on there. So Earth's environmental systems, they involve feedback loops. A system is a network of relationships among parts, elements, or components that interact with and influence one another through the exchange of energy, matter, or information. Sometimes a system's output can serve as an input to the same system, a circular process described as a feedback loop. I just read that slide. And a negative feedback loop, or output that results from a system moving in one direction, acts as an input that moves the system in the other direction. Here's an example now where an input creates an output, and the output comes back in and changes the direction. And then in a positive feedback loop, they have the opposite effect. Rather than stabilizing a system, they drive it further toward an extreme. In positive feedback, increased output leads to increased input, leading to further increased output. And one example is in cool climates, sunlight reflects off white surfaces. As the climate warms, sunlight is absorbed where dark surfaces are exposed. And as more of the ice melts, there's more dark surfaces exposed, more light is being absorbed, and just more and more water is being exposed. This is a great example of a positive feedback loop. So systems show several defining properties. In a system stabilized by negative feedback, when processes move in opposing directions at equivalent rates so that their effects balance out, they're said to be in dynamic equilibrium. Processes in dynamic equilibrium can contribute to homeostasis, the tendency of a system to maintain constant or stable internal conditions. It is difficult to understand systems fully just by focusing on their individual components, because systems can show emergent properties, characteristics not evident in the components alone, and this is the whole is not the sum of the parts. Systems seldom have well-defined boundaries, so deciding where one system ends and another begins can often be difficult. No matter how we attempt to isolate or define a system, we soon see that it has connections to systems larger and smaller than itself, and systems may exchange energy, matter, and information with other systems, and they may contain or be contained within other systems. So environmental systems interact. For a scientist interested in runoff, or the precipitation that flows over land and enters waterways, and the flow of water, sediment, or pollutants, it may make the most sense to view the bay's watershed as a system. In environmental science, identifying the boundaries of a system depends on the questions being addressed. The dead zones in the Chesapeake Bay are due to the extremely high levels of nitrogen and phosphorus delivered to its waters from the 6 states in its watershed and the 15 states in its airshed. and the airshed is the geographic area that produces air pollutants that are likely to end up in a waterway. And additions of excess nutrients to a water body can lead to algal blooms, increased production of organic matter that will die and then sink, and decomposition and loss of dissolved oxygen. Elevated nitrogen and phosphorus inputs will cause phytoplankton in the bay water to flourish. However, the process of nutrient over-enrichment, blooms of algae, and increased production of organic matter, the subsequent ecosystem degradation is known as eutrophication. And inputs into the Chesapeake Bay from the adjacent systems, they cause a eutrophication and loss of oxygen or hypoxia. And as we can see, the entire watershed involves multiple areas and systems from forests, industries, cities to farms, and the dissolved oxygen at some points is incredibly low, all the way to nearly 0 milligrams a liter. We may perceive Earth systems in various ways. Scientists sometimes divide Earth's components into structural spheres. The lithosphere is the rock and sediment beneath our feet, the planet's uppermost mantle and crust. The atmosphere then is composed of the air surrounding our planet. The hydrosphere encompasses all water, salt or fresh, liquid, ice, or vapor, and surface bodies underground and in the atmosphere. So all of the water. The biosphere consists of all of the plant's organisms and the abiotic, non-living portions of the environment with which they interact. The study of interactions among living and non-living things is a key part of ecology at the ecosystem level. And as we've been talking about, the boundaries of these overlap, so systems also often overlap. Ecosystems. So an ecosystem we talked about before is something that consists of all organisms and non-living entities that occur and interact in a particular area at the same time. Ecosystems are, again, systems interacting living and non-living entities, and British ecologist Arthur Tansley felt there was so much interaction between organisms and their abiotic environments that it made the most sense to view living and non-living elements together. For instance, in the Chesapeake Bay estuary, a water body where rivers flow into the ocean, which is where the salt and freshwater mix, aquatic organisms are affected by the flow of water, sediment, and nutrients from the rivers that feed them and from the land that feeds these rivers, despite these being abiotic factors. Ecosystems are systems that receive inputs of energies, process and transform that energy while cycling matter internally. They then produce outputs such as heat, water, and animal waste products that enter other systems. Energy flows in one direction through ecosystems. Most arrives as radiation from the sun, powers the systems and its organisms, and exits in the form of heat. Matter, in contrast, is generally recycled within ecosystems. Energy is converted to biomass, so as autotrophs such as green plants and phytoplankton convert solar energy to the energy of chemical bonds and sugars through photosynthesis, they perform primary production. Specifically, the total amount of chemical energy produced by autotrophs is termed gross primary production. The energy that remains after respiration that is used to generate biomass, ecologists call net primary production. Heterotrophs use the energy they gain from plant biomass for their own metabolism, growth, and reproduction. Some of this energy is used by heterotrophs to generate biomass in their bodies, which is termed secondary production. Ecosystems vary in the rate at which autotrophs convert energy to biomass. The rate at which this conversion occurs is termed productivity. And ecosystems whose plants convert solar energy to biomass rapidly are said to have high net primary productivity. And here we have a bar graph of various ecosystems and their total net primary production. As we can see, algal beds and reefs and tropical rainforests are definitely the highest productivity ecosystems, where desert and open ocean, understandably, are some of the lower producing. And this is just a slide that shows net primary productivity increases with temperature and precipitation on land, and then within aquatic ecosystems, it increases with light and nutrients. As I was just talking about, nutrients increase productivity. And nutrients are elements and compounds that organisms consume and they require for their own survival. Elements and compounds required in relatively large amounts are called macronutrients, and then nutrients required in smaller amount then would be called micronutrients. Nutrients stimulate production by plants, but a lack of nutrients can limit productivity. And oxygen is a nutrient, and when a water body experiences hypoxia, this can become a limiting nutrient and limit production. Increased nutrient pollution from farm cities and industries have led to development of over 500 documented hypoxic dead zones globally as of 2010. And this includes the Chesapeake Bay that we've been talking about, as well as a very large dead zone that forms each year in the Gulf of Mexico, near the coast of Louisiana and the mouth of the Mississippi. So here we can see a very large influx of nutrient have caused a limiting of another nutrient. The good news is that in locations where people have reduced their own nutrient runoff, dead zones have begun to disappear, so there's definitely hope. So as you probably would know on your own, ecosystems interact with one another. For some purposes, scientists even view the entire biosphere as a single, all-encompassing ecosystem. Adjacent ecosystems may share components and interact extensively, making it hard to define a certain line between them. So landscape ecologists, they study geographical patterns, and landscape ecology is a broad-scale study of how landscape structure affects the abundance, distribution, and interaction of the organisms within. A landscape is made up of a spatial array of patches spread over the landscape in a mosaic or complex pattern. Here we have an example where we have a couple patches of different ecosystems such as grassland, river, and ecotone, and they all come together to form a mosaic of this larger ecosystem that we might want to look at. So the scale at which an ecologist focuses will depend on the questions he or she is interested in or the organisms he or she might be studying. The specific habitat needs of an organism will often determine its distribution across patches and possibly its division into networks of subpopulations or metapopulations. Because of extinction risk, metapopulations in landscape ecology are of great interest to conservation biologists. Because human development, we often create fragment habitats, and we create these small isolated patches, forcing metapopulations from a larger population. And one great way to get around this is habitat corridors that can link patches. And I know Florida and the Everglades systems have been implementing these to encourage just the travel of organisms from one patch to another. Remote sensing helps us apply landscape ecology. As more scientists take a landscape perspective, they are benefiting from better and better remote sensing technologies. A common tool for research in landscape ecology is Geographic Information System, or GIS. It's a computer-based software, and it consists of multiple types of data, for instance, on geology, hydrology, topography, and multiple other variables you might want to know, and combines them in a common set of geographic coordinates. So we're taking spatial data on multiple variables and things of interest and putting them into a geographic system. As we can see here, in GIS you can bring these layers of human development, fauna, flora, hydrology, geology, and put them all on top of one another, and we can get the view of the whole landscape. GIS has become a valuable tool used by geographers, landscape ecologists, resource managers, conservation biologists, and the principles of landscape ecologies and tools such as GIS are increasingly used in regional planning processes. So modeling can help ecologists understand systems. Models are simplified representations of complex and natural processes, and ecological modeling is a practice of constructing and testing models that aim to explain and predict how ecological systems might function themselves. Because ecological processing involves so many factors, ecological models can be mathematically very complicated. And if we're just looking at it from a scientific perspective, models are essentially hypotheses about how a system might function. So returning to ecosystem services, which we talked about a little bit earlier, ecosystem services, they really sustain our world, and when Earth's ecosystems function normally and undisturbed, they provide the goods and services that we could not survive without. And these natural resources are the same as ecosystem services. Ecological processes form the soil that nourish our crops, purify the water we drink, and the air that we breathe. They store and stabilize supplies of waters that we use, pollinate foods and plants that we eat, and we receive and break down some of the waste that we dump and the pollution we emit. One of the most important ecosystem services is the cycling of nutrients, and these are called the biogeochemical cycles. And here's just an infographic on a couple of them and the nutrient cycles. So nutrients, they circulate through our ecosystems in these biogeochemical cycles that I was talking about. Nutrients move through the ecosystem in nutrient cycles or biogeochemical cycles. Nutrients and other materials move from one pool or reservoir to another, remaining for varying amounts of times, and this is called the residence time in each reservoir. The rate at which materials move between reservoirs is termed a flux, and the flux between any given reservoirs can change over time. So when a reservoir releases more materials than it accepts, it is called a source, and on the other side, when a reservoir accepts more materials than it releases, this is called a sink. And here's a photo of this, where the source here is the source of a larger amount of flux with a short residence time, and it receives a small flux. And then the sink, on the other hand, has a very long residence time, or how long the resources stay in it, and it accepts large flux while giving off a smaller flux. And human activity has influenced certain fluxes, and the water cycle is one that we're going to talk about first, and it affects all other cycles. Water is the central medium for most biochemical reactions. The water cycle or hydrologic cycle summarizes how water in liquid, gaseous, and solid forms flow through our environment. The oceans are our main reservoir, and it holds 97% of all water on Earth. Less than 1% of our planetary water is even usable by humans. Water moves from the hydrosphere into the atmosphere by evaporation, a conversion of a liquid to a gaseous form. Water also moves into the atmosphere via transpiration, the release of water vapor from the leaves of plants, or evaporation from surfaces or organisms. Water can then return from the atmosphere to Earth's surface as precipitation when water vapor condenses and falls as rain or snow. This moisture may be then taken up by plants and used by animals, but much of it flows as runoff into streams, rivers, lakes, ponds, and then the oceans. Some precipitation and surface water soaks down through the soil and rock and then becomes groundwater, water found beneath layers of soil. Groundwater can then recharge aquifers or sponge-like regions of rocks and soil that are underground reservoirs of water. The upper limit of groundwater held in an aquifer is referred to then as the water table, and groundwater becomes exposed to the air where the water table reaches the surface. Exposed water can then run off or evaporate. And here's just a brief infographic of the water cycle. So, as I was saying, humans have impacted these geochemical cycles, and the water cycle is no exception. Our impacts to the water cycle have been extensive, and this is due to removing forests and vegetations. It increases runoff, and then the soil will erode, which will further increase runoff because there's no more infiltration into the soil, and then it reduces transpiration. Irrigating agricultural fields, it's a large amount of water required to grow a crop, and this depletes rivers, lakes, and streams, and it just lowers water tables. Damming rivers can slow the movement of water from land to the sea and increase evaporation. Emitting air pollutants changes the nature of precipitation, and this sabotages the natural process of evaporation and transpiration. So moving on from the water cycle, we're going to talk about the carbon cycle, and it circulates a vital organic nutrient. As we all know, carbon is found in all organic matter. Carbon is an ingredient in carbohydrates, fats, proteins, bones, and cartilage, as well as the shells of all living things. And the carbon cycle describes the routes carbon atoms take through the environment. This occurs in photosynthesis, cellular respiration, and in energy transfer between trophic levels and food webs. Sediment storage of carbon occurs in fossil fuel deposits and sedimentary rock. So decomposition returns carbon to the sediment. Aquatic organisms die and they settle in the sediment. And in fact, oceans are the second largest reservoir of carbon. And here's just another really great infographic, and this one's about the carbon cycle, both terrestrial based and oceanic based. And one of the real problems we're facing these days is we're shifting carbon from the lithosphere to the atmosphere. By mining fossil fuel deposits, we're essentially removing carbon from an underground reservoir with a residence time of millions of years. And by combusting fossil fuels in our automobiles, homes, industries, We release this carbon dioxide and greatly increase the flux of carbon from the ground for the air, where normally there'd be a very small flux from the sink that would be the underground carbon. And this movement of carbon from the atmosphere back to the hydrosphere, lithosphere, and biosphere has not kept pace. So in addition, cutting down forests removes carbon from the pool of vegetation and releases it to the air. And if less vegetation is left on the surface, there are fewer plants to draw CO2 back out of the atmosphere. So the ongoing flux of carbon into the atmosphere is the driving force behind today's anthropogenic or human-influenced global climate change. Some of the excess CO2 in the atmosphere is now being absorbed by the ocean water, and this is causing ocean water to become more acidic, leading to problems that threaten many marine organisms. And even with all this knowledge, our understanding of the carbon cycle is not yet complete. So then moving on to the next cycle, the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle involves specialized bacteria. Nitrogen makes up 78% of our atmosphere by mass and is the sixth most abundant element on Earth. The nitrogen cycle involves chemically inert nitrogen gas, which most living organisms cannot use. This makes the atmosphere the major reservoir for nitrogen. To become biologically available, inert nitrogen gas, or N2, must be fixed or combined with hydrogen in nature to form ammonia, NH3, whose water-soluble ions of ammonium can be taken up by plants. Nitrogen fixation can be accomplished in two ways, and one's by the intense energy of lightning strikes, but another more practical method may be when air in the top layer of soil comes in contact with a particular type of nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and these bacteria live in a mutualistic relationship with many types of plants, including soybean and other legumes, providing them nutrients by converting nitrogen to a usable form. Other types of specialized bacteria then perform a process known as nitrification. In this process, ammonium ions are first converted into nitrate ions, then into nitrate ions. So from ammonium to nitrite, NO2 negative, into nitrates, NO3 negative. Plants can take up these ions, which also become available after atmospheric deposition on soils or in water, or after application of nitrite-based fertilizer. So then the next step in the nitrogen cycle occurs when denitrifying bacteria convert nitrates in soil or water to a gaseous nitrogen via a multi-step process. Denitrification thereby completes the cycle by releasing nitrogen back into the atmosphere as a gas where originally it came into the cycle. Here's another really great infographic, and this one, instead of the carbon cycle or the water cycle, this time this is the nitrogen cycle both in oceans and on a terrestrial landscape. So, should be no real surprise, but we've greatly influenced the nitrogen cycle as well. Historically, nitrogen fixation was a bottleneck, a step that eliminated the flow of nitrogen out of the atmosphere. However, the Haber-Bosch process allows humans to synthesize ammonia, accelerating its flux into other reservoirs within the system. So originally, when the first step of taking the nitrogen out of the atmosphere and turning into ammonium, that was a bottleneck because the main reservoir of nitrogen then is in the atmosphere. But with a human-made process, we can increase the speed of this step, thus increasing its flux into the other reservoirs that maybe traditionally aren't used to holding so much nitrogen for so long. Overuse of fertilizer has a lot of negative side effects. It increases the flux of nitrogen from the atmosphere to the land, and this then, when it runs off into our local waterways, can cause eutrophication in estuaries and coastal ecosystems and fisheries, and it washes essential nutrients out of the soil. Burning fossil fuels also adds nitrogen compounds to atmospheres, and this contributes to acid precipitation. So the last cycle we're going to tackle today is the phosphorus cycle, and it circulates a very limited nutrient. The element phosphorus is a key component of cell membranes and several other molecules vital for life, including DNA, RNA, ATP, ADP, and the phosphorus cycle has no appreciable atmospheric component. The vast majority of Earth's phosphorus is contained within rocks and is only released by weathering. Aquatic producers take up phosphorus from surrounding waters, whereas terrestrial producers take up phosphorus from soil water through their roots. This element is then passed through consumers to decomposers back to the soil and the food web. And again, we affect this cycle too. People increase phosphorus concentrations in surface water through runoff of the phosphorus-rich fertilizers we apply to lawns and farmlands. We also add phosphorus to waterways through release of treated wastewater rich in phosphates from domestic use of phosphate detergents. And tackling this nutrient enrichment requires several diverse approaches, and these approaches have widely varying costs for the same level of nutrient reduction. We could reduce fertilizer use on farms and lawns. Naturally, that would probably be the easiest. Apply fertilizer at times that might minimize runoff. Plant vegetation buffers around the streams so these buffers can take up the nutrients beforehand. Restoring wetlands and creating artificial ones is a great way to have somewhere to take all these nutrients. Improve sewage treatment technologies. Maybe we should treat the phosphorus before we release it back out. And then a big one we should all be trying to do is reduce fossil fuel combustions. A systematic approach to restorations is really the only way to go about it. So thinking in terms of systems is important in understanding Earth's dynamics. Life interacts with its non-living environment and ecosystems, systems through which energy flows and matter is recycled. Natural systems provide us a blueprint to mimic as we move toward greater sustainability in the modern society. And these systematic approaches to restoration has really been offering hope for the Chesapeake Bay, and it's great to see how it might be going forward. So that's going to be the end of the lecture for today.